Karen slapped elderly woman for asking for help reaching a shelf. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was just past 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, the kind of time when the grocery store was busy but not yet overcrowded. The store's wide aisles were filled with the soft rustling of carts and the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights above. The smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery section wafted through the air, mixing with the crisp scent of produce, and the faint noise of canned goods being stacked by employees added to the low hum of activity. The store had a clean, familiar feel to it, a place where regular customers went about their routines, collecting groceries for the week ahead. Behind the front registers, a 65-year-old woman named Mrs. Thompson shuffled slowly through the aisles, her white hair tied in a neat bun, her hands clasped tightly around her shopping list. Mrs. Thompson was a regular customer at the store, a kind-hearted woman who had spent most of her life in the neighborhood. She wasn't in a rush, she never was anymore, and moved at a leisurely pace, carefully picking out her groceries. Her hands shook slightly, but it didn't stop her from picking up fresh vegetables, checking labels, and occasionally pausing to chat with familiar faces along the way. It was a quiet, peaceful morning for Mrs. Thompson, and she was enjoying the calm of the store. She had reached the aisle with canned goods when she noticed that a can of tomato sauce she needed was on the top shelf. The cans were stacked high, and while she could still see the item, it was just out of her reach. Mrs. Thompson had been coming to this store for years and knew that she could always count on the store employees for assistance. She stood on her tiptoes, stretching her arm as far as she could, but it was clear that she wasn't going to be able to reach it by herself. Just then, as she was about to give up and move on to something else, a woman walked past her in the aisle. This woman, who seemed to be in her early 40s, had a brisk, almost irritated pace as she pushed her cart along, glancing at the shelves as if she were too important to acknowledge the people around her. She stopped just a few feet away from Mrs. Thompson, and the older woman, ever polite, turned toward her. "Excuse me," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft but respectful. "Could you please help me reach that can on the top shelf? I'm afraid I can't quite get to it." The woman, Karen, didn't immediately respond. She turned to glance at Mrs. Thompson, her eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating whether she should help or not. There was a slight pause before Karen spoke, her voice sharp and dismissive. "You can't reach it yourself?" she asked, her tone laced with irritation. Mrs. Thompson, who had grown accustomed to the occasional bit of impatience in others, nodded and smiled gently. "I'm afraid I'm not tall enough anymore, dear. It's just a little out of my reach," she explained, hoping to soften her request. "I would really appreciate it if you could grab it for me." Karen looked up at the shelf, then back at Mrs. Thompson, her lips curling into a small, barely concealed sneer. She didn't move, didn't offer to assist. Instead, she stared for a moment, her eyes flicking over the older woman with an unreadable expression. There was something about her demeanor that made Mrs. Thompson feel uncomfortable, though she couldn't put her finger on exactly what it was. "Why don't you just get it yourself?" Karen said finally, her voice dripping with disdain. She shifted her weight, looking as though she was about to continue walking, but then stopped herself. "It's not that high, you know," she added sarcastically. Mrs. Thompson felt a chill run through her, the sharpness of Karen's tone catching her off guard. She had only asked for a small favor, and yet this woman's response had been so dismissive. She hesitated, trying to process the interaction, and before she could think of how to respond, Karen took a step closer to her, her eyes still locked on Mrs. Thompson. "What's wrong with you?" Karen continued, her voice rising slightly. "You should be able to do it yourself. Stop asking people for help all the time." Mrs. Thompson blinked, taken aback by the unexpected aggression in Karen's voice. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her composure, trying to understand what had just happened. This woman, who had been a stranger to her only moments ago, was now scolding her like a child, as if asking for help in a grocery store was some kind of offense. Mrs. Thompson didn't know what had triggered this woman's outburst, but she could feel the tension building in the air between them, and she realized that this wasn't going to end quietly. "I'm sorry if I've bothered you," Mrs. Thompson said softly, her voice filled with hurt but still polite. I didn't mean to inconvenience you. I just thought I could ask for a little help, that's all. Karen didn't respond with sympathy. Instead, her face twisted with irritation, and in one swift motion, she raised her hand and slapped Mrs. Thompson's hand away from the shelf, knocking it away as if it were some sort of inconvenience to her. Mrs. Thompson gasped in shock, her heart skipping a beat at the sudden, violent gesture. The slap wasn't hard, but the force behind it was enough to startle her, and the cold, aggressive nature of it left her speechless for a moment. Get your own damn groceries. Karen snarled, her voice now filled with an ugly edge. You don't need to be asking for help all the time. You think you're entitled to it just because you're old? Mrs. Thompson's mouth opened in disbelief, the sting of Karen's slap still echoing in her hand. The younger woman stood there, her eyes flashing with anger, the ugliness of her words hanging in the air like poison. For a moment, all Mrs. Thompson could do was stand there, trying to collect her thoughts. She had never expected something like this. She had only asked for help, a simple request, and yet this woman's cruelty had taken her completely by surprise. She felt as if the world around her had momentarily spun out of control. The few other shoppers who had been milling around the aisle, sensing the escalating tension, stopped what they were doing and looked over at the two women. The atmosphere shifted, as if the store itself had become a stage for this sudden, unexpected confrontation. Mrs. Thompson, still reeling from the shock of Karen's slap, finally found her voice. I didn't deserve that, she said quietly, her voice shaking, but firm. I only asked for help, and you slapped my hand. I don't know what's wrong with you, but you shouldn't be treating people like that, especially not an elderly woman who's just trying to get her groceries. Karen, realizing the attention they were starting to gather, quickly turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath as she walked away, her footsteps fast and heavy. The aisle was silent now, the other customers exchanging awkward glances, unsure of how to proceed. Mrs. Thompson stood there for a moment longer, her hands still stinging, before she slowly bent down to grab her can off the shelf, her eyes no longer focused on the woman who had assaulted her, but instead on the small task she had set out to complete. As she slowly made her way to the checkout line, Mrs. Thompson's mind was still reeling. She had asked for help, just a simple request, and had been met with cruelty. But as she moved forward, she realized that the kindness she had always known, the world she had trusted to be understanding, still existed. There were people around her who saw the injustice of what had happened. It might have been one moment, one woman's temper, but it wouldn't define her. And when she reached the checkout line, her smile returned, soft but resilient, as she greeted the cashier who politely began ringing up her groceries. It had been a troubling experience, but Mrs. Thompson knew that she would continue on, one grocery store visit at a time. The grocery store, typically a place of routine for Mrs. Thompson, had become unexpectedly uncomfortable. The quiet hum of the overhead lights, the soft rustle of plastic bags, and the slow shuffle of carts became almost oppressive in the wake of Karen's outburst. Mrs. Thompson, her heart still racing from the slap, stood frozen for a moment, her hand lingering in the air where Karen had struck it. The sharp sting of the contact had sent a shock through her entire body, leaving her momentarily unable to move or process what had just happened. The warm light of the store, which had previously felt inviting, now felt foreign, cold, and almost hostile. She had not expected to be treated with such aggression, especially for something as simple as asking for help. She had come to the store for the same mundane tasks she had performed countless times over the years, picking up the weekly groceries, enjoying the little conversations with familiar faces, and maybe picking out a fresh bouquet of flowers if she felt like it, but she had never imagined that something as routine as this would turn into such an ordeal. Still stunned, Mrs. Thompson slowly lowered her hand to her side, her fingers trembling slightly. She had always prided herself on being polite and respectful, always following the social norms and expectations that had guided her through decades of life. She had learned to navigate the world with kindness and understanding, and though she had witnessed unkindness before, she had never been the target of such a blatant and unfounded attack. The sting of Karen's slap was still sharp, but it was the harsh words, the bitterness that had laced the entire interaction, that made Mrs. Thompson's chest tighten with a knot of disbelief. "Get your own damn groceries," Karen had said, her voice dripping with disdain. It wasn't just the slap, it was the tone, the dehumanizing way she had dismissed Mrs. Thompson, as though her very existence had somehow become an inconvenience. The aisle around her felt strangely empty now. The few customers who had been browsing nearby had all either quickly turned their attention away or started walking briskly in the opposite direction, unwilling to get involved in the sudden tension. There was a part of Mrs. Thompson that wanted to shout at them, to demand someone stand up for her, to ask for help. After all, she was in pain, both physical and emotional, but she knew better than to expect anyone to intervene in such a situation. People were too busy with their own lives, their own concerns, to get involved in a conflict between strangers. Still, the isolation she felt in that moment was crushing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence, her age, had somehow made her an easy target for Karen's ire. As she slowly walked away from the shelf, carefully stepping around the scattered cans of soup that had fallen when Karen had pushed her hand away, Mrs. Thompson's eyes darted to the register. She had planned to finish her shopping quietly, as she always did, but now, her mind felt disoriented, and her confidence was shaken. She had always been able to count on simple politeness, the basic decency of others, to get through her day. But Karen's actions had cut through that expectation, and Mrs. Thompson didn't know how to process what had just transpired. Could she just move on, pretend like nothing had happened? Could she continue shopping as if the slap had been some kind of misunderstanding, or was it something deeper, something about her age, her vulnerability, that had caused Karen to treat her so harshly? As she made her way toward the dairy section, Mrs. Thompson noticed the security cameras placed throughout the store. She wondered if they had recorded the incident. She wasn't sure if she was ready to make a scene or bring it to the attention of the staff, but the thought of doing nothing made her feel small, like she was letting Karen win. She had been humiliated in front of strangers, and she couldn't simply walk away from that without some acknowledgement, some justice for the way she had been treated. But how could she ask for that? Who would even believe her? She was just an old woman, after all, and Karen had made sure to cast the blame on her from the very beginning. You should be able to do it yourself, Karen had said, as if Mrs. Thompson's frailty was an inconvenience, a failing. It made Mrs. Thompson feel weak in a way she hadn't felt in years, as if her very existence had become something to be tolerated, not valued. Pushing those thoughts aside, she focused on getting the rest of her items. She grabbed a carton of milk, her fingers still trembling as she clutched the container to her chest. The cold was a small comfort, offering her a brief distraction from the painful memory of Karen's outburst. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let one person ruin her entire day. She wouldn't let Karen's cruelty define her experience at the store. She would go about her day as she had planned. She wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, make her feel less than she was. When Mrs. Thompson reached the checkout, she was relieved to find that the line was short. A few customers ahead of her were busy with their own purchases, and the cashier, a young woman named Emma, greeted her with a friendly smile. Emma was a regular cashier at the store, and over the months, Mrs. Thompson had become accustomed to the polite and efficient way she handled the register. It was the kind of normalcy she craved, a reminder that the world wasn't all bitterness and entitlement. As Emma rang up her items, Mrs. Thompson's mind kept returning to the incident with Karen. She found herself replaying the moments over and over, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted when Emma looked up at her, her smile still warm. "Is everything okay?" Emma asked, sensing that Mrs. Thompson seemed quieter than usual. "You seem a little off today." Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, considering how to respond. Should she share what had happened? Should she explain that she had been slapped by a stranger in the store over something as simple as asking for help? The thought of recounting the events made her stomach twist, but she realized that maybe it would help to talk about it. After all, she couldn't keep everything bottled up inside. Actually, Mrs. Thompson began slowly, her voice quieter than usual. There was a little misunderstanding earlier with another shopper. I asked her for some help reaching something on a high shelf, and she wasn't very kind about it. Emma's expression shifted to one of concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that." "That's awful," she said, her eyes filled with empathy. "People can be so rude sometimes." You didn't deserve that. Mrs. Thompson nodded, grateful for Emma's understanding. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to ease some of the tension she had been carrying with her since the altercation. Thank you, she said softly. It's just, I didn't expect it. I've been coming to this store for years, and I've never had anyone treat me like that. It's just hard to understand. Emma finished scanning the last of Mrs. Thompson's groceries and smiled at her reassuringly. Well, I'm glad you told me. If you ever need to talk about it more, or if you ever want me to go speak to the manager, just let me know. You're a valued customer here, and no one should treat you like that. Mrs. Thompson smiled back at Emma, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was enough to know that someone cared, someone understood. Thank you, dear. I really appreciate it. As she left the store, her bags in hand, Mrs. Thompson felt a little lighter, though the memory of Karen's aggression would stay with her for a while. It wasn't the kind of day she had expected, but she had made it through. The world still had kindness in it, and she had learned that even the smallest acts of empathy could make a difference. As Mrs. Thompson made her way through the automatic doors of the grocery store, the cool morning air outside greeted her, and the bustle of the parking lot seemed almost like a reprieve from the heated tension inside the store. The sun was shining brightly, but it did little to lift the heaviness in her heart. She had made it through the ordeal, of course, but the sting of what had happened, both the physical slap and the sharp words from Karen, lingered in her thoughts, clouding what would have otherwise been a peaceful morning. The rhythmic shuffle of her shoes against the pavement, the sound of the car doors opening and closing as other customers loaded their groceries, all faded into the background as she walked slowly toward her car, her shopping bags dangling from her arm. As she reached her vehicle and placed the bags in the trunk, she couldn't help but replay the moments in the store over and over again, as if trying to make sense of something that, in her mind, simply didn't make sense. How had it gone from a simple request for help, asking a stranger to retrieve a can from a high shelf, to such a violent outburst? Mrs. Thompson had lived a long life, and she had seen her share of difficult moments, but this felt different. It felt cruel. The slap had been unexpected, shocking in its suddenness, but what truly shook her was how someone could so easily dismiss another human being, someone who had merely asked for help, and then escalate the situation into a physical confrontation. She had asked for a simple favor, and in return, she had been met with disdain, aggression, and, of all things, violence. She slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, her hands trembling slightly as she did so. The car roared to life, but it was as if everything around her had slowed down. The hum of the engine felt distant, and the world outside her window seemed almost muted, as though she was seeing it through a fog. The scene in the store was so fresh in her mind, so vivid, that it felt like it was happening all over again, even though she was already well outside the store parking lot. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, trying to push the memories away, but they clung to her like shadows. It wasn't until she reached her neighborhood that she began to feel a slight sense of calm settle in. Her little house, with its well-tended garden and the smell of fresh flowers wafting in the air, always had a way of making her feel safe. She parked the car and sat for a moment, just staring at the front door of her house, willing herself to go inside and leave the remnants of the morning behind her. But it wasn't that easy. It never was. The image of Karen's face, the way she had sneered at her, the coldness in her voice when she had told Mrs. Thompson to get her own damn groceries, stuck with her. Mrs. Thompson had seen plenty of rude people in her life, people who cut in line, people who were too busy to hold the door for others, but this was different. Karen hadn't just been rude. She had been violent, and that was something Mrs. Thompson wasn't used to. It was an uncomfortable truth that she had to face. She had been assaulted by a stranger, and no amount of wishing could change that. Sighing deeply, Mrs. Thompson opened the car door and stepped out, her legs feeling heavier than usual. She grabbed the grocery bags from the trunk and walked to her front door, letting herself inside with a small sense of relief. The coolness of the interior greeted her, and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet was a comforting sound. As she set the bags down on the kitchen counter, she absent-mindedly began to unpack them, going through the motions of putting things away as if it were just another ordinary day. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Her mind kept wandering back to the incident, and the more she thought about it, the more unsettled she felt. It wasn't the slap that bothered her the most, it was the way she had been dismissed so completely. Karen had slapped her hand away as if she were a nuisance, a bother, just for asking for help. It was as if the simple act of needing something from another person had made her unworthy of kindness. Mrs. Thompson had been polite, patient, and respectful. She had asked for a small favor, as anyone might when something was just beyond reach, and yet Karen had treated her as if she were a child who didn't deserve assistance, someone who should have known better than to ask. The words Karen had used, "Get your own damn groceries," stung more than the physical contact itself. They were words designed to strip away Mrs. Thompson's dignity, to reduce her to something small and insignificant. And yet, in a strange way, Mrs. Thompson realized, those words said more about Karen than they did about her. They reflected a deep-seated anger, a frustration with the world that had nothing to do with Mrs. Thompson and everything to do with the person who had chosen to express it in such a cruel way. As Mrs. Thompson unpacked the rest of her groceries, her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was far from focused on the task at hand. She thought about the store manager, Lisa, and the way she had been so quick to stand up for her when Karen had left. That small act of kindness had stuck with her, reminding her that not everyone was like Karen. In fact, most people weren't. Most people would have helped, would have shown compassion, and Mrs. Thompson knew that. She had experienced it countless times in her life. It was just that, in moments like these, when someone pushed her too far, it became all too easy to lose sight of the good in the world. But Lisa's reassurance, her willingness to offer support, had been enough to remind Mrs. Thompson that there were still people who cared. Sitting down at the kitchen table, Mrs. Thompson found herself thinking about her late husband, Harold. He had been the kind of man who would never have tolerated such treatment of anyone, let alone an elderly woman asking for help. He had always been kind, always treated people with respect, and had taught her to do the same. She missed him more than she could say. The house felt emptier without him, and even in moments when things were going well, the absence of his steady presence weighed on her. He had passed away several years ago, but she still carried his memory with her, and today, she wished more than ever that he was here to talk to help her make sense of what had just happened. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Mrs. Thompson picked it up, and to her surprise, it was Emma from the store, the cashier who had been working when she checked out. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson?" Emma's voice was warm and friendly, a stark contrast to the events of earlier that morning. "I just wanted to check in and see how you were doing after everything that happened. I'm really sorry you had to go through that, and I wanted to make sure you're okay." Mrs. Thompson felt a lump form in her throat. No one had ever followed up like this before. It was unexpected, kind, and exactly the kind of reassurance she needed. "Thank you, Emma. I'm doing better, but it's been a difficult morning. I just don't understand how someone could act like that." Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, and she realized, not for the first time, how much she needed someone to listen. "You don't have to explain it," Emma said gently. "Some people just take their frustrations out in the wrong ways. But we're all here for you. If you ever need anything or want to talk about it, don't hesitate to reach out." Mrs. Thompson smiled softly, the warmth in Emma's words comforting her in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." After hanging up, Mrs. Thompson sat back in her chair, feeling a quiet sense of relief wash over her. The day had not gone as she had hoped, but she was not alone. There were still good people in the world, people who would listen, who would care. Maybe that was enough. The rest of the day passed in a haze for Mrs. Thompson, though the weight of the morning's events still lingered, a quiet, uncomfortable presence in the back of her mind. She had tried to carry on with her usual routines, making tea and sitting by the window to watch the birds flit about her garden, but the images of Karen's angry face and the slap that had caught her off guard played over and over again. Each time they resurfaced, they hit her like a wave, threatening to pull her under. She tried to brush it aside, telling herself it was just one bad experience and that she shouldn't let it define her day, but the sting of both the physical and emotional blow still lingered, more stubborn than she wanted it to be. The phone call from Emma had been a small but powerful balm to her frayed nerves. It had reminded her, in the most unexpected way, that there were still people out there who cared, who would stand by her when things got rough. It wasn't just a kindness, it was the kind of human connection that she had always believed in, even when things felt difficult. Emma's genuine concern was something Mrs. Thompson had not expected, and it left her with a sense of warmth that she hadn't realized she needed. The call made her feel seen in a way that Karen's cruel actions never could, and it allowed her to push through the lingering discomfort and humiliation that had consumed her earlier. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden glow across the front yard. The air had cooled, and Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of quiet peace slowly begin to settle over her. She had always been one to find solace in nature, and as she stepped outside to water the plants in her small garden, she found comfort in the familiar routine. The flowers and shrubs, though small and unassuming, had been a constant in her life for years, growing and blooming in much the same way that she had. They provided a sense of stability, a quiet assurance that, despite the chaos and unpredictability of the world, there were still things that could be relied upon. As the water from the hose sprayed gently over the leaves, Mrs. Thompson let herself breathe deeply, closing her eyes for a moment to focus on the simple act of caring for something that needed her. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing, their laughter floating through the air like a reminder that life still went on, even after moments of frustration or sadness. She allowed herself to smile at the sound, reminding herself that, no matter how hurt she had been earlier, life had a way of moving forward. People would always have their own struggles and frustrations, and sometimes, those emotions would spill over in ways that were completely out of her control, but that didn't mean she had to carry their negativity. She didn't have to let Karen's actions take root in her heart. She didn't have to let the unkindness of one person taint her entire perspective on the world. It was in that moment that Mrs. Thompson realized something important. She had spent so much of her life valuing kindness, politeness, and respect, and those things were still worth holding on to. But there was also strength in setting boundaries, and standing up for herself when necessary, and not allowing someone else's cruelty to diminish her own sense of worth. The slap, the harsh words, they hadn't taken anything from her except for a fleeting sense of security, a momentary belief that everyone was kind. But in the end, it had reminded her that her value didn't lie in what others thought of her or how they treated her, it lay in her ability to choose how to respond, to decide what to carry with her and what to leave behind. As she finished watering the last of her plants, Mrs. Thompson felt a quiet resolve settle within her. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough. She wasn't going to forget what had happened, and she wasn't going to pretend like it didn't hurt, but she was also no longer going to let it control her. She wasn't going to let it take up space in her life. It was time to move on. The evening passed slowly, and by the time Mrs. Thompson was sitting down for dinner, the storm inside her had begun to settle. The small meal she prepared, nothing fancy, just some soup and a slice of bread, was comforting, and she ate slowly, savoring the peace that had gradually returned to her home. As the sun set, casting soft colors across the sky, she felt the weight of the day slip away. The heaviness that had clouded her mind earlier had faded, replaced by a sense of quiet acceptance. She had made it through the day, and she would continue to make it through the days to come. Her life, as ordinary as it sometimes felt, was still full of moments that mattered: the phone call from Emma, the sound of children laughing in the distance, the care she put into tending her garden. These were the things that mattered most, and these were the things she would focus on moving forward. As the evening darkened and Mrs. Thompson finished her meal, she cleaned up the dishes and made her way to the living room, where she sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were just beginning to appear, scattered across the deep blue canvas, and she allowed herself to relax into the quiet of the moment. The events of the morning seemed distant now, a memory that would fade with time, and in its place was a feeling of calm. It had been a difficult day, but it was just one day. It was a reminder that the world wasn't always kind, that people could sometimes be cruel, but that kindness and resilience still had a place in the world. Mrs. Thompson had been through many difficult moments in her life, but she had always come through them stronger, more capable, and more aware of the importance of staying true to herself. She wasn't going to let one person's anger define her. She wasn't going to let it change how she viewed the world. Instead, she would continue to move forward, carrying with her the lessons she had learned along the way. And as she sat there in the quiet, with the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room, Mrs. Thompson realized that, despite everything, she was okay. The world might have its unfair moments, but she was still standing, still finding beauty in the small things, still committed to the life she had built. The rest of the day may not have gone as she had hoped, but it had reminded her that even in the face of cruelty, she could choose how to respond, and that was something no one could take from her. And so, with a small smile, she leaned back in her chair, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would be a new day, one where she would continue to find strength in herself, in the kindness of others, and in the quiet moments of peace that life still had to offer.